All right. Good morning, everybody. My name's Bradley Freeman. I'm from Janet UK. I'm a member of their CSERT team. I'm going to be giving a kind of an overview about what we do and how we detect and deal with incidents, primarily security incidents on the Janet network, including our perspective, what our role is, config, because config is still a massive threat to our network and the internet as a whole, how we use Netflow to find nasties on our network, copyright infringements, and go through some of the other kind of work we get to do. So it goes without saying that you should be pretty familiar with Janet because of the work that other people in Janet have been doing in this community. But we're very, very, very unique. And our network and the stuff we do on our network probably won't reflect what you do on your network. Your network might be larger and more complex than ours. And we've got kind of a strange perspective on things, which I'll come to in a minute. Our network runs at 40 gigabit a second in the backbone and 40 gigabit a second hardware that's cheap, and that we won't have issues upgrading to 100 gig when we come there. It only really exists in my dreams. Because we're the UK's research and academic network, we have an academic perspective on everything we do, and that certainly affects how we handle security on our network. Generally, we kind of believe in the good of the internet, openness, freedom, and privacy. So we run a totally open network, which I'm sure a lot of you won't do. That means we don't block any ports at all. All ports on our network are open on stuff that's commonly, used by worms and botnets, such as 139 and 445. And we very, very, very block IPs. I was at a presentation, really, and another ISP was talking about how we block the whole country of Romania. We'd never do that. We might block 1 or 2 IPs at a time. Generally, we block our own IPs more than we block the internet, but it'll only be in relation into an actual threat which affects a large number of our users. We don't do any deep packet inspection at all. It's not really practical at our speeds and the size of our network. It's also possibly not legal, but that's a whole different kettle of fish. But generally, it's because of the privacy issues. And all the end hosts and the data it doesn't originate on our network, it originates on connected networks. So there are issues with scanning it to look for threats. We don't do any scanning whatsoever. So if you're not familiar with a CSIRT, as Keith said, or a CSERT, we're a computer security incident response team. You might be more familiar with an IRT or a CERT, which they're all 3 names for essentially the same thing. Our job role is to coordinate within our community and work with other CERTs and other ISPs in relation to security threats. And within our community, we provide advice and assistance in relation to security incidents with confidentiality. More and more, a lot of universities and smaller sites get hit with problems which other sites have experienced, so it's really valuable for them to kind of see what other sites are doing. There's a story in the media at the moment relating to a university which has been hit with a virus in the last couple of days, and that's of interest to all the other universities because some of them, I'm sure, will be hit with the same kind of thing. A lot of the smaller sites on Janet, we have schools and small colleges. Some of them really have no idea. They're experts on Windows Server 2003, they're experts in Active Directory, but they don't really know how to deal with tracking down a spam bot that's coming from their network. So 2 security tools that we find scale very well are the Janet Acceptable Use Policy and the Janet Security Policy. These are, without a doubt, the best things we have in our arsenal. They pretty much define what the end site should do. So we try and mandate that they have somebody there who's got a clue. We don't want them connecting a switch to our backbone and all of their PCs directly into it. And we try to ask them to implement stuff like sufficient logging, whatever that might mean. They have to interpret that themselves. But it gives us leverage to, if there is a security issue and they're not going to look into it, we'll block their IPs. So this is a pretty graph to give us an idea about what we get to deal with. In the year 2009, we dealt with nearly 7,000 security incidents. We classify an incident not as an individual log, or we've raised incidents from to other networks, has kind of stayed around the same. We don't really raise incidents when people try and scan Janet. There's just so much we wouldn't be able to do it. So most of the unsolicited bulk email and scanning most of it is related to stuff which comes out from Janet. That's kind of stayed around the same. So is the corner cases from other. The copyright infringements appear to have increased dramatically over the last couple of years. I'll come to how we deal with the copyright infringements and why they might be slightly flawed in a moment. The other big thing, and the massive increase, is also to do with compromise. We classify a virus infection as a compromise, or it could equally be a server that's rooted. But the majority of the compromises are going to be stuff like configure. It's not that the fact that the network's getting more dangerous, we're just dealing with the compromises better, and we're able to detect them far better using Netflow. There'll be more on that in a second. But Configure is still a massive threat. If you're not familiar with Configure, there's quite a few variants, but the three you should be aware of is A and B, which connects to a small number of domain names, and Configure C, which connects to a huge number of domain names to find their command and control servers. Configure C will generate a list of 50,000 domain names a day from 110 TLDs, of which it will resolve 500 of them to look for the command and control server. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult to block. We can't block any specific IPs because it might pop up anywhere on the internet, and it's very difficult for the registrars to cooperate to mitigate Configure effectively. Configure A and B has been mitigated very, very well, but Configure C, because it requires cooperation from so many TLD operators, from what I've heard, it's able to update. When Configure came out, there wasn't really any processes in place from ICANN. Oh, but I'm not a domain name buff. There are some people who are incredibly, very, very skilled with DNS. I'm not so skilled, so apologies if I mangle the truth slightly here. When Configure came out, there wasn't really processes in place from ICANN to get domain names resolved across a number of TLD operators. Because of this, they've come up with the expedited registry security process. This enables registrars to more effectively deal with domain names which are being used for malware. Currently, there's 6.8 million IPs infected with Configure. There's going to be significantly many more hosts because of the joys of NAT. From 12,000 autonomous system numbers. This shows these graphs are from Shadow Server. The Configure Working Group, which is very closely connected to Shadow Server. This shows the yearly Configure population since when it was released. Now, Configure A and B occupies, about 6.5 million infected IPs at the moment, and that has increased significantly since its release. But because it's the person who controls this botnet has not control of that botnet. So this is one of the world's largest botnets, but luckily, because of the work of TLD operators, it's not able to update. Now, Configure C is what A and B will attempt to update to if it can. It tries to update through the command and control servers, or it tries to update through a peer-to-peer method. That's only got a very small number of infected hosts. But there are such a huge amount of hosts on your network that if the botnet controller got Configure working again, it would seriously impact your network operations. I don't want to be at the receiving end of 7 million IPs. So this shows the number of Configure infections on a UK commercial ISP. This is autonomous system number 2856. This ISP here has, this autonomous system has 10.5 million unique rooted IPs from 189 prefixes. Again, these results are from Shadow Server. And you can see a huge amount of infections. They're approaching nearly 8,500 infections on the network, which is a massive number. And it appears to be going up over time. So from this, I personally might be able to conclude that they're not taking measures to actively mitigate botnets in their network. The next graph shows Janet. Remember, this has got 10.5 million IPs from 189 prefixes. On Janet, we got 7.5 million IPs from 190 prefixes. So kind of a comparable size, different scenarios. I'll come on to that in a second. But from this, you can see that we've had a big increase in late September, early October. That's going to be because students, that's the new academic year, so people get new laptops, they go home, they get infected, they come back on the network. That's always going to be a busy time for us. But you can see we actively take measures to mitigate Configure, and as opposed to having 8,500 infections, we've only got a couple of hundred. But it's not really a like-for-like scenario. It's kind of impossible to do in our environment. NAT is used heavily in academic networks, and we've got the fantastic advantage, which pretty much all of you won't have, where we have a technical person who's responsible on these sites, responsible for several thousand computers. So we can go put pressure on them to get the problem fixed, whereas if you're a commercial ISP targeting members of the general population, they might not be able to deal with that effectively. But we do attempt to resolve every single infection. We track. The Configure Working Group and Shadow Server have purchased some of the domain names which are used by Configure, and they point them to sinkholes. We track HTTP connections to these sinkholes, and that indicates to us from Netflow infected hosts. So we can deal with them almost live. We get reports within minutes of a Configure host updating, and we try and deal with that at the site. You can also see how your network looks. Now, this is highly recommend you go to shadowserver.org and you can get reports for your autonomous system number or your netblock. They don't just report on config, they can report on DDoS attacks originating from and being sent to your network, a whole range of things. Spam relays, proxies, shadowserver.org, highly recommended, fantastic group. It's totally free servers at the moment. We use Netflow quite heavily, and Netflow is one of my best friends. I love Netflow. It is not a replacement for an IDS. We do a hell of a lot with Netflow. We detect a lot of compromises with it, but it doesn't have all the features of an IDS, but it does scale significantly better than an IDS. We use it across our network. Now, we try and sample 1 in 10. Speaking to people that they think that's impossible, how can you sample 1 in 10? I'm not the person to speak to about the implementation of this. There's probably some other people who might be more qualified to speak about that, but we try to get 1 in 10. It might not be 1 in 10 throughout the network, but we try and get 1 in 10. Within CSERT, we then process 125,000 Netflow records a second, which is a fair bit of data, as you can imagine. So we've got a couple of techniques we use to find malicious stuff on Janet. So our database splits the Netflow data up into 30-minute blocks. So I was able to get some quick stats on a 30-minute block. And every 30 minutes, we track flows to 4 million unique destination IPs. That's a lot of data. Now, there's a couple of block lists we can use. For instance, there's a block list created by emerging threats, but that's got over 7,500 entries. They have a shorter version, which is the botnet command and control server, but that's going to have 1,500 entries. If we started tracking flows to all of these IPs, they're not very descriptive in the data. It could be, we don't know whether that IP is totally malicious, and we could get a lot of false positives. Because I reckon, from the data we've seen, a lot of those command and control servers are going to be hosted on compromised hosts, which have legitimate websites. They could be hosted on free serving operators, which have a huge number of websites per IP, or bulletproof hosting, where there could be some other dodgy websites there, but they're not necessarily malicious. So what do we look for? One of the best ways one of the best tools we've developed using Netflow is we score omnidirectional flows coming out from Janet. So let's say, for instance, somebody decided to scan a Class C, so they sent out 255 ICMP echoes. If they were scanning, they probably only get around about a 10% reply rate. So let's say they only got 20 replies, and so there'd be 220 omnidirectional flows coming from their IP. We then do a weighting on the number of omnidirectional flows per IP, and we have a greater weighting for commonly exploited sockets, such as port 22, 445, 3389, and we have a lesser weighting for stuff which is used for stuff like BitTorrent, although we do generate reports if it reaches a certain threshold. So this allows us to see outbound scanning from our network and other suspicious activity with a high number of omnidirectional flows. We also do a number of on-demand reports. We can access the data straight away, and if there's an incident which is going on, we can see archives of what's going on our network. We don't have any backups of our Netflow data. Because we use it for a security tool and not for intruding on our users' privacy, we keep it for a very limited amount of time. You know, it's going to be more than a couple of days and less than a few weeks. We also have no backups of this data. Once the data's gone, it's gone forever. In the previous graph, my pretty graph, you saw we were dealing with an increased number of copyright infringement notices. This is an example of one of the many, many copyright infringement notices we receive. Essentially, this is what we see is the copyright holder gets companies like Media Century to send out these notices on bulk. This person was downloading 90210, which should be a breach of the AEP by itself. So this is the evidence they send us, and this is what we're interested in, and we're not interested in the whole Lego mumbo-jumbo. So they give us the name of the work, the date it was found. You might notice the date it was found was an exact second. It's not a range of time. They give us the IP address and the port, and it's 99% BitTorrent. Sometimes students are absolutely stupid enough to host the material on their own servers. You know, they probably deserve what they're going to get if they're going to host copyright material on their own server. And there are some other protocols, but it's 99% BitTorrent. We've dealt with a huge number of these, and from what we found is in the past they've accused sites of copyright infringement, and these sites have got impeccable logs, and they haven't been able to find these records in the logs at all. We've also found that they've accused printers before downloading illegally and address space which isn't being routed, which is kind of unusual. So looking into this a bit further, what we found is, and what we're able to deduce from this, they're able to get the list of IPs which are downloading illegally from the BitTorrent tracker. They pull down a list of IPs which are downloading illegally from the tracker. They then report infringements on every single one of those IPs to the ISPs, and we pass them on. We just pass them on. We don't enforce the law on these people. We let the sites deal with it as an internal matter. But I'm pretty sure that the people who run these trackers are aware that they're doing this. So they're going to put fake IPs in the list, so the copyright infringement people aren't 100% sure that they are downloading illegally. So the evidence they send to us is, it indicates that somebody might be downloading illegally, but it's not a certainty. And I'd probably be, personally, not the company's perspective, I'd be concerned if they were doing this on a larger scale and it was actually going further than somebody just getting a warning through the post. Because it's not always copyright infringement. We also deal with a fair few RIPA notices. If you're not familiar with RIPA, lucky you. Essentially, it's the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. This is where government agencies, councils, police forces, even fire brigades can send you through. They ask for logs of communication data. So they'll give you an IP, they'll give you a time, and tell me who that person was using that at the time. Now, we don't have the data they're looking for because they're kind of looking to help someone or put someone in handcuffs. We don't know that because we put in a big connection to a school. So we pass these on to the school, and because we're concerned about data protection and privacy, we try and step out the loop as soon as possible. Because of the nature of our users, unfortunately, we do get a few of these which get directed to us because we do have a lot of miners on our network, which unfortunately are the targets of some dodgy people. Our DNS infrastructure on Janet has been used a fair bit for distributed denial of service attacks. In this example on the left, somebody has just, one of the servers has been configured to send out the root hints. Now, in this case here, the attackers were sending a very high volume of small UDP packets. They could have been like small queries, which would generate a much larger response. Because of the nature of UDP and its connectionless, they spoof the source IP, and that in turn will cause an amplification of attack on a third party. There's not a huge amount we can do for this. It's a problem potentially in DNS. Again, there's going to be better DNS people here than me. I don't think this is a problem we're going to solve overnight. We can stop root hints being sent out. We can stop servers being open resolvers. But still, we still see some of our servers being used in this manner. This is an example of the kind of run-of-the-mill work we have to do. So we keep an eye on what's going on in the security community. And somebody on a mailing list called Full Disclosure was very kind to us, and they gave us a list of command and control servers with very, very granular information about what that command and control server was. In this case, a load of PHP MyAdmin, there was a vulnerability in PHP MyAdmin in around about, I think it was April last year. Yeah, and proof of concept code to exploit this came out in June. Now, a lot of sites, particularly the smaller sites, will install something like PHP MyAdmin on the server and have that server totally open to the world and forget about it and never patch it. So a lot of servers got compromised. Using this kind of stuff, we can easily detect it, and we're using Netflow. We match that data up in Netflow, and we're able to solve infections on a huge number of sites, many of which weren't even aware that their servers were compromised because the servers weren't doing anything. Unfortunately, phishing attacks is a massive problem on our network, and phishing attacks causes a lot of headaches. It's been very, very common. The phishers went through a phase of liking free hosting companies, and we don't think that there's that many distinct groups of phishers. There's only a couple of groups from what I've seen. The reason I think that is because they target the same free hosting company, and they'll put their phishing site on the same hosting company, will take it down, and then it'll appear on the same hosting company. And then after a while, they'll move on to another hosting company. So from that, there's not going to be that many groups. So they went through this phase of liking free hosting companies, but just because these guys sell free hosting, well, don't sell free hosting, they give away free hosting, doesn't mean that they don't want to be responsible. And as long as you can get two-way communications with someone at the company, the minute you can get somebody on the phone or somebody starts sending you an email back, they will nearly always work with you. And I think, well, 3 distinct companies we've worked with, and they've all implemented measures to prevent phishing attacks on their free hosting environment. They've done stuff like look at the referral logs to their site. If they see a spike in traffic coming from URLs which have mail in it, they think that's either being sent out from spam or phishing. And some people just implementing simple scanning of files to look for suspicious files. But unfortunately, it's not just security incidents we have to deal with, and anything which might be outside of the acceptable use policy comes to us. So recently, we've had to deal with feuding couples. couples on Janet decided to split up and send some nasty emails to each other. And of course, they decided to get us involved and say this was a breach of the AUP, thinking somehow we're the police and we'd be able to stop the argument, which is not the case. We've had angry lawyers actually send us letters. They send us letters about emails, which I found a bit strange. So they'll print off their email, they'll print off the headers, somehow they'll figure out how to do that and demand to know who this person is. Obviously, we can't pass that information on. That has to come through a RIPA notice. We won't disclose any information on our users. We've had one farmer call us up, and whenever you typed in his farm, which was running from his business, into Google, some council minutes mentioned that he had some fire engines stored in his farm, which are like party fire engines. He asked us to remove them from the internet. They were on a council website, so I suppose it's kind of under our constituency, but again, it's not really outside the acceptable use policy. And in the last couple of months, we've had a couple of mathematicians complain that Usenet posting regarding physics discussions had overflowed onto the maths mailing list. And about a year ago, some lady in America who has no connection at all to Janet, we have no idea how she got hold of our email or decided to contact us. She's in America. She sent us a huge wad of paper, it's a big wad of paper from the US, probably about 50 pages, and then she decided to circle and highlight and underline every attack from like 10.0005, 10.001. She accused us, which was RFC 1918 address space, of attacking her network. Yeah, it's a nightmare. If you do have any security issues on Janet or any kind of queries that are security related, please contact our desk, which is irt@csirt.ja.net. All our details are on there. But if you've got any questions to me personally which aren't related to security incidents, you can unicast them to me. Are there any questions? At the back? Oh, we need a mic.
Hi, Scott Armitage from Loughborough University. Working? Okay, I have two questions. First of all, what percentage of incidents are you dealing with that are IPv6 related as opposed to v4?
Now, what I didn't mention in the presentation is our current Netflow system was written in-house, and it's having a few issues of scaling, so we're looking to replace it. So because we're looking at replace it, our Netflow system doesn't handle IPv6 at the moment, so we don't have any Netflow data, and we don't generate reports from that. As of yet, I'm not aware of a single security-related incident which we've dealt with on IPv6.
Okay. And the other thing was, you mentioned that NAT is heavily used within education. I was just wondering how you drew that conclusion, because, I mean, I'm more aware of the fact that hardly anything's NATed.
Sure. Probably from your environment, from a university environment, you're privileged enough to have a huge amount of address space. Yeah. We have had environments where we've had to put a block on IPs, and we've taken off entire campuses. Generally, it's not going to be universities, because they would have got in years ago when IP address space was, very, very cheap and easy to get. Well, not that it's expensive, but it was easy to get big blocks. We're aware that if we put blocks on IPs, we do take off whole schools offline, and we speak to schools and smaller sites all the time, and very often they're using proxy servers. They're using that heavily in their environment. It's very heavily used, and not so much in the larger sites, but definitely in the smaller sites. We have several thousand users behind particular IPs.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Thomas Mangin, Exanetworks. How much storage do you need to keep those Netflow records?
We've got a SAN which reaches capacity. The amount of logs we keep is the extent of the SAN. I don't know the exact size of the SAN, but it's more than 10 terabytes, and I think it's less than 20. It's a considerable size, considering they're only very small files. Keith?
Question off the IRC room. Will Janet be building a bespoke system to handle the copyright information requests that will be generated by the Digital Economy Bill, or will each institution be doing that separately?
Within CSERT, we have no plans to build such a system. We have some of the rules which apply to commercial ISPs in relation to copyright infringements don't really relate to us. For instance, if we got 3 strikes against a large university, we're not going to disconnect that university because there's going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of users. So in that kind of way, some of the stuff won't apply to us directly, but that would be not something we're planning to do at the moment.
Hi, Ian Meikle from Nominet. Could you go back to the pretty graph that you had?
Sure.
That one. Between, what about March 2009 and about July, there's a large wodge of something that you've marked other, which then has declined again. What is that?
The large wodge of other might have been some test stuff we were generating, because unfortunately we don't have a category mark test. Because Configure has been such a huge problem, we had to start automating Configure. It was a bit tedious to begin with, to start sending out reports to 1,000 sites which have infections. So we had to start building in scripts which automatically send out emails and updates, just because I don't want to be somebody who copies and pastes emails all day. So we built a couple of scripts then, and there was, in that time, a little bit of testing. So that would be why. We don't have a category for other. We can't delete from our system. Our system, once something goes in our system, that's it. You can't change it, you can't delete it, it stays there. Law enforcement likes that, apparently. So, anything else? Cool. Cheers.
Okay, thank you, Bradley.
Yeah, it's all right.